So, Maryam, thank you for coming on the podcast.
So excited to be here.
My first question for you is, why do you help people tell their stories?
First is, I think that as a society, we need to hear new ideas and new stories from new storytellers, because I think that's where we're going to find the solutions to the big problems that we're facing. But I also think it's unreasonable to think that people or groups of people who've never been listened to before or never been encouraged to speak are all just going to spontaneously start speaking in an eloquent, persuasive way. So that's why I think you kind of have to help that process along. The other side of it is, and something I've come to more recently, is that I think speaking and telling your story is healing.
One of my favorite psychologists speaks to the stories that we assume in terms of costumes that we wear and the ability to kind of unzip from certain costumes and certain stories when they no longer serve us, and how we can begin to do that by creating a little bit of objective distance from the thoughts and feelings that we often feel so consumed by. I'm curious to hear what some of those costumes have looked like in your own life, perhaps that you've reflected on and thought, you know, this is no longer serving me, and what the catalyst was for that.
I felt like such an outsider for so long because the stories that society told of me were ones of not belonging. I embraced it as a survival technique. I think lots of people in alternative communities do this. I then thought that because I was an outsider, there were lots of things that were not for me. Like lots of life experiences and lots of, I don't know, whatever it might be that I could no longer access or should no longer access or didn't want to access anymore. And then something very odd happened, is that I wanted to access one of them and I found it very difficult. So in essence, I got engaged last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. In my whole life, I never wanted to get married. I still think marriage is like a corrupt institution. I do not like the idea of like the ownership that it used to imply and all of the stuff that we've all heard. It's almost a cliche now, right? Except the thing is, I fell in love with someone who's so amazing. And for a long time, I had this thing of like, when are they going to ask me? And I hated that narrative because that wasn't me, because I never wanted it, right? I was never supposed to have wanted this because I'm not mainstream. And so I struggled with that for a really long time.
Yeah.
And then one day, and this is what the story is about, it just came to me fully formed as like an idea of how I was going to ask him to marry me. And I didn't know the transformative power it would have, because the clothes I was wearing at the time was, this isn't for me. I'm, this person. By asking him to marry me, and by the way, he did say yes, so it was a happy story. I was able to all of a sudden access a whole thing that I thought was inaccessible. One big one, another big one that I've felt a lot in my life is the kind of idea of being the imposter. I struggled with imposter syndrome for so long in my life. Like that real feeling of like, I am faking it, I'm a fraud, I'm wearing this confident, comfortable, knowledgeable, intelligent costume. And inside, I'm just none of those things. And it's going to start showing soon and someone's going to figure it out.
When did that imposter syndrome bubble up to the surface most extremely?
I moved to America, to New York, when I was 13. In the UK, I was a top student. I was a geek. I had no friends, but I was great at school, In the US, I could understand the system and I started to like fail out of my classes. And I never really recovered until my senior year. So I never really felt smart again. And so then when I did get into an incredibly good university in Canada and went there, one of the top in the world, I was like, wow, why'd they let me in here? Imposter syndrome makes you very scared, right? That people are going to find out that you aren't the right person for this job. And so what the knock-on effect of that is you isolate yourself. So right. I started to isolate myself in my work. I wouldn't let people in. I wouldn't tell them about what I was doing. I would like hide away and do the work. And then I would get really upset that no one was engaging with me or value what I was doing. If you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you're part of the LGBTQI community, if you're poor, working class, migrant, refugee, living with a disability, all the things that aren't just a cisgendered, straight, able-bodied, upper class white man in the West.
I fill all of those boxes but one.
Of course you feel like an imposter. Literally all of society has been designed to make you feel like an imposter. You're basically told in subtle and not so subtle, in conscious and unconscious ways through your entire life that you don't belong here. So then, surprise, surprise, you grow up thinking you don't belong here. And then people like me come along being like, oh, it's just in your head. You need to figure it out. No, yes, there is stuff going on in your mind, sure, but it's also societal programming. And it's just another way that we make people feel bad about themselves to say that it's the individual responsibility. It's not. It's like the society we live in. And it's the more we tell people, oh, there's something wrong with you, the less we take the collective responsibility around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and that's it. There is so much onus and emphasis on the individual, isn't there? And I think it's also a kind of like manifestation of this sort of like positivist psychology, which is really, you know, it's about mastering your mindset and it's being your best and brightest self and all of those things. And yet it completely disregards the systems in which we operate. And it continues to perpetuate as well this kind of idea that we're these, you know, fully autonomous, rational creatures that are just responding to, you know,
stimuli.
Exactly. And it completely denies the human experience.
I'm Middle Eastern background, and so I don't necessarily have a love for collectivist societies either, because I see the pressures they put on women. I see the way that they suppress like certain kinds of like sexual gender identity. You know, I think that idea of that, like the good, like for the good of the whole, is as damaging as the individualistic kind of perspective of like as for the good of the individual. But I think like so many things in life, why is it one extreme or the other? Like the whole point is that the I think happiness lies in the middle.
Absolutely. There was an interesting theory that I was reading up on recently, which was looking at mythology throughout human history and the different myths and narratives that we have subscribed to. And it first unpacked, you know, religion and dogma and control and very much this kind of like dominion complex. And then how we transitioned into the world of science, which is very much like mechanistic kind of thinking and reductionism and breaking things into their parts. And most recently, the paradigm we're in is one that is economic, where everything is commodified, be it nature and appreciating the tree, not for the tree, but for the table or the paper it provides, or as human beings, you know, realizing the 9 to 5.
So true.
What, if we talk about those overarching kind of narratives, from your view, from your standpoint, how does that narrative need to evolve, and how can we get better at not only telling the stories that are going to bridge there, but identifying where those pockets of the future are in the present?
I got to hear George Monbiot speak this past summer at TED Summit in Edinburgh. I mean, like, massive fan. Love his writing. And he spoke about the idea of the restoration myth. This idea that we don't have a restoration myth that works for modern times. And it made me think a lot about that, about, you know, do we have a narrative that's working for us? And by that I mean, there are some narratives that are working really well. They're just not working for people who believe in what you and I believe in. Right. If you think about it. Yes. The narrative of the far right is working very well. Islamophobia works. It's a tool that people use to gain power and dominance, and it's effective because people allow it to happen. So there are narratives that are working very, very well. What we don't have is a progressive, cosmopolitan narrative that is working.
Why?
On the right, it's easy to have a monolithic kind of singular story. Everyone subscribes to it. Yeah. Because the right doesn't value diversity. On the left, you value diversity. So you value the difference and you value the many, which doesn't lend itself to having really good singular narratives, right? It lends itself to having lots of pluralistic voices. And so we're stuck in this kind of tug of war.
And I think you touched on something super important, which is the whole idea of progressivism is inclusivity and creating the space for multiplicity and diverse stories and diverse opinions. And I've even found myself referring to this idea that we need to create, a better story of the future. And yet I'm speaking in a very singular term. Like the future isn't some stable construct. It needs to be the multitude of stories into which people can project themselves so they can begin to bridge and understand what that is going to look like for them. But it's something that we're so desperately in need of, especially in the sustainability kind of climate space, is what that looks like. And we're okay at kind of projecting the utopian vision of what a society could look like, but it's super reductionist, and we are not trying hard enough to actually bridge between what today and tomorrow looks like.
The whole point of everything I do is about getting these new voices in, right? These new stories to talk about and to be able to contribute to creating these new futures that work for lots of different kinds of people. The question is, are we ever going to be able to find a way to bring that all together? Or will we have to utilize some other form of humanity to do that, like a greater external threat?
Yeah. I mean, and that's the tricky thing though, is like with a mounting sense of scarcity coupled with overwhelm in the face of these big messy challenges, it's so easy to revert to, tribal kind of mentality and looking back rather than being able to look forward in the face of uncertainty.
We have a scarcity mentality for everything that is not scarce, and an abundance mentality for everything that is scarce.
Interesting.
So when it comes to like the environment and a natural world, we just think we can take as much as we want and it's going to be fine. But when it comes to things like being able to love or have more than one identity, or have enough jobs in your country for all the people who've lived there for 3 generations and all the people who want to come in, or, all of these things where actually we've been taught that the world is either or, and actually it's both and.
Yeah, and we project our own stories onto other people, of course. This savior complex that is very holier than thou. Yeah. And kind of, it's just, you're so beholden to your own ego when you're communicating from that place that you're not actually working in the interest of solving these problems, because obviously that has to be done from a place of inclusivity. Yeah. And it's one of the challenges that I found even working in the kind of youth climate space when you're protesting and you're pointing the finger at these institutions of power, is that you strip them of their humanity, and in doing so, you hold yourself in a relationship of dependency with those people in positions of power, because there is so much kind of projection happening. But if you can take all of that away and say, actually, I'm trying my best, and so too are you. I mean, that's been a really big turnaround in my mind, even coming from the not-for-profit space and then engaging with corporates. And I'm like, I love you as a human being, and you're amazing, but you too feel powerless as a corporate executive in the same way that 11-year-old does protesting in the street.
All my friends went into like the UN, politics, human rights, NGOs, all of that, international development. So I came out at when I was like 20, however, 21 from my undergrad with that worldview that it's us and them. I don't think, 36-year-old or 35-year-old me is as aligned maybe with 25-year-old me here, because I think I'm less skeptical of corporates, because I think that they're not what they were 10 or 15 years ago. That's part of it, is that you have to allow people to change.
What I have witnessed that scares me a little bit operating in the kind of like business world is that you see that light in their eyes of, a past self who had all of the kind of dreams and ambitions of the young people today before those dreams were kind of pushed into the furnace of the industrial complex. And they're now having to operate in a system where responsibility is to their family and actually maintaining the status quo, because they've been the beneficiaries and the architects of that system. And so it's, how can we bring together the kind of radicalism, naive optimism, energy of young people with the knowledge of experience and the knowledge of failure and making mistakes? Like, how can we create those kind of synergies?
In my first year of my psychology degree, I learned probably one of the most valuable things, which was this idea of the hedonic treadmill. So this idea is that you get on this treadmill at some point in your life, normally when you graduate. And at the beginning, you think to yourself, oh man, if I could just make that, I don't even know what it would be in today's money, but like, if I could just make £30,000 a year, that would be like all the money I would ever need in my life. Yes. And I'd be so happy, and I'd be able to do all the things, and I'd be so content, and I can't wait. And then like a few years later, you do. And then you're like, I'm really happy for about, 6 months to a year, maybe 2 years if you're good. And then you think, I could just make 40,000. And then, and that all sounds like very innocent. But then what you do is you later on in life, you start meeting people who are like earning, because that's what it is about part of the corporate lifestyle, right? Is that your earning potential is so much higher. Who are earning £250,000 a year and who are living on that as if it would be impossible for them to not live on it.
Yeah.
And then you catch yourself doing it. It's like the way we become desensitized to violence. You can become desensitized to like money and to wealth and to achievements and just want more and more and more.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's being aware of that, I think.
Do you think one of the effective ways of unshackling from that and that psychology is to have a mandate that is bigger than yourself, that creates the kind of conditions for courage?
But I think the idea of having a motivation, having something that allows you to step out of the day-to-day and give you perspective is what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I recognize that I'm saying this from an extreme place of privilege, but also witnessing my parents who in 2008 lost everything in the global financial crash. And we went from being, wealthy and money not being something that we had to think about after they had spent 30 years kind of accumulating and both, coming from poor backgrounds.
Yeah, that's devastating.
Literally in a matter of, I think it was 8 days, suddenly in enormous debt. And we're kind of looking around like, what can we sell? What can we do?
Wow.
Where do we move from here? And it was their incredible entrepreneurial kind of spirit, which I feel like I've carried into my own life, which was they looked at the one asset we still had, which was our home. And they said, we're going to turn it into a wedding venue. Like, that's what we're going to do. We're going to invite people to come here and get married. And from there, managed to rebuild, turn it into a business. And it was that kind of grit and tenacity, which I think imbued me in those moments where, 2 years ago, having 73 pence in my bank account, I didn't start spiraling. I was like, well, we're just going to make this work because it's not about what I'm doing tomorrow. It's about the bigger picture and things will work themselves out. And it's part of what I try to instill in some of the passionate young people I work with, because I feel like immediately, as you mentioned, one of the enormous barriers is, okay, but how does this fit into the 9 to 5? I really care about this cause. I really care about this mandate. But, I'm feeling this enormous pressure to make this certain figure, even at the expense of my own happiness and my own sense of fulfillment from having that mission.
Because I think that a lot of people in my situation that I've met, so like who grew up maybe without that kind of money with different parents, their parents always try to instill in them this idea of you've got to create security, you've got to create stability. They're like 20 something and they're deciding what to do and they're thinking, my parents want me to buy a house, I need to buy a car, I need to support my family, and these are all absolutely legitimate things. Yeah. And you're so miserable.
Yeah.
And it's just, I don't have, I think it's really sad actually. Because I think that's how you just become a bit of a zombie walking through your life. And that's part of why we're in this situation, right?
Yeah. And I think it's the nature of the education system as well. And it's part of the reason, similarly, I could really relate to your story of, moving from the UK where you were thriving to going into the American system where you're like, what the heck is happening?
Yeah.
Because
Why can't I do math?
Yeah. So I had a similar experience, which was completely self-imposed, but moving from school in the jungle at the Green School, which is all about fostering your innate talent and your passion and following your curiosity. And it's very much you are the custodian of your own learning, to a system in France where it was so bureaucratic. There was so much red tape. It was literally like one day in our English class, which in itself was a joke, and which I failed for speaking Australian English.
Amazing.
We watched Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, which shows the factory workers going through the works as these kind of like sheep that are completely mindless. And I was looking around at my peers thinking like, we are those worker bees like in this system. Like we are perpetuating this. Every class was, being dictated to from the front of a classroom out of a textbook, taking notes mindlessly. It's a tragic system. And I feel so privileged to have gone through that system at Green School, because I then had the objectivity to go into the system in France and say like, this isn't actually about me, even though it brought into conflict so many of the ideas that I had about myself, because in Green School I'd been such a higher achiever and super smart and whatever. And then suddenly I'm in a system where I'm like just doing terribly, But I think with that, so many young people go through similar education experiences where they come out the end feeling really stupid. And that is because they themselves have learnt to plaster over all of that curiosity, all of that questioning, all of that passion.
So I was very lucky. So I don't know if you've heard of something called Landmark, the Landmark Forum.
Yeah.
Right. So my mentors / teacher in high school, his wife was a VP of Landmark, one of the very first. So what we learned in that course was Landmark, but for young people. I learned how to listen. I learned how to communicate non-judgmentally. I learned how to understand that there are stories that you tell about the world, and they're not necessarily true. I learned how to be courageous about issues like, we're talking, I graduated in 2001. So late 90s, no one was out in our school. But, we had the LGBT, local kind of community forum come and talk to us. We went to the hospital where they discovered the AIDS virus, and we talked to people who were HIV positive. Just imagine if everyone had that, how well equipped they would be to go into the world.
It has been reflected in some of the early stage research that we've done with young people in the UK. One of the biggest barriers for them is not feeling like they have a voice in society. And I realized upon reflection in my own life that one of my greatest strengths and one of the things that has really propelled me is the ability to tell my story and the confidence in my own story and how the failures have served me and the mistakes have served me. I suppose, what would your invitation be for young people looking to tell their stories better?
Yeah. You have to get through the first draft. The first time you speak or write or think your own narrative, it's not going to be good. It just won't. And anyone who tells you otherwise is just lying. They just are. You have to get through your shitty first draft. That's it. Whether you're writing, whether you're speaking, whatever you're doing. But don't do it in the most vulnerable place. Be smart about it. Choose it. Choose it to kind of get that version out, speak it, say it, whatever, in a place of relative low risk. And not a huge amount of vulnerability, so that when you get to a place where you are, challenging yourself to be more vulnerable, you have more experience speaking it.
Life is sort of a series of shitty first drafts, isn't it?
I mean, absolutely. I think the thing that you don't realize when you're doing your shitty first draft is how boring it becomes when it's really good. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a real joy to mastery. Absolutely. I agree. But the thing is if you just lived in a life of mastery, you would never, ever be doing something new.
I mean, that keeps so many of us from realizing our goals and our ideas and being courageous, is that fear of outcome and that attachment to expectation. And I remember, and I feel like that moment after you give the speech or you push yourself out of your comfort zone, that is the most critical moment, more so than anything else in that process. When I did my first kind of public speaking stint, it went really well because I was very well rehearsed. And then that response led me to being a bit of an upstart and not bothering to rehearse the second time, which meant that when I got up on stage, 30 seconds in, I got the worst stage fright of my life because all of the words completely vanished from my head. And it was the most crippling experience of my life, but it was also one of the most important, because that key moment afterward, I could have decided that's the last time I'm ever doing public speaking, because that was so painful and humiliating, and I put my heart out there and it was stamped on. But I chose to try again. And I feel like that is super, super key, is realizing that that the most essential ingredient in this kind of equation is the comfort and the sort of curiosity and joy for failure and for screwing up and trying again.
When I work with speakers, I talk about the valley of death. Right. So this is true for writing, for rehearsing, for delivering your talk. Think of it as like a U shape where, or like a valley, exactly like a valley, like a U-shaped curve where it starts lower, but the end is higher, right? When you start, often just to have the courage to start. So you start and you're pretty good, right? And you think this is cool, it's good. So you keep going, and then you just get really bad. You just crash. Sometimes if I'm writing a talk or something, I'll have this great version come to me while I'm in the shower, and I sound great in the shower, and then I come back and I try to put it on paper, and it's totally not good. That's when you're crashing into the valley of death. Most people stop there. They think, oh, see, I shouldn't have rehearsed. I shouldn't have even thought of it. I should have just been spontaneous on the moment. No, because that will mean you will always just be middle. You have to push through the valley, keep going, keep practicing, keep writing, keep whatever until you come up. And then you kind of break through. And then all of a sudden you are so much better than you even thought was possible. Most people just stop in the valley. They don't realize they're there. They think they've done something wrong, because how could you be worse if you've been doing it more?
It also speaks to the kind of rose-tinted lens through which we present incredible people in society and change makers and activists, and social media obviously perpetuates it, right? We want to put the best version of ourselves forward, and I'm guilty of it as well. I don't expose my vulnerabilities in the same way I do my wins, and I see that the negative consequences of that in young people who look to the Greta Thunbergs of the world and say, oh, but she's so courageous and she's so smart, and look at how she's able to stand up in that room of 1,000 people, without breaking a sweat. I could never be her. I could never do what she does. Forgetting that her first step, her first action was literally planting her bum on the steps of Parliament. Alone, holding a cardboard sign. And it's I feel like we have a responsibility as well to tell that journey a little better. I
agree. I think not just for young people, I think older people have a real responsibility. So I was coaching recently a group of creatives on pitching. I just don't know what they're looking for, the senior creative directors. We've just never seen them pitch. And I was like, excuse me? And they're like, we're never invited in to the pitches. I've never seen my creative director pitch. I just don't know what he's looking for. So I'm nervous. And I was like, well, that's ridiculous. So then I went to talk to another agency I was working with. And I talked to my partner who runs an agency. And it was like, oh yeah, I mean, our junior people don't see us pitch because we're off doing that. And I was like, how are they ever going to see the progression? How are they ever going to see you getting better? How are they ever going to see what you're looking for? How are they ever going to see that journey? Even earlier today, I was at an event, and I don't think this person did it maliciously at all, but it made me think. And I think it was true for them. I went up to them and I said, I thought your presentation was amazing. And I said, oh, I just wrote it yesterday. And I thought to myself, if I was a young person, I would feel so intimidated by this. What you should actually say is, yeah, it was a little rough. It's my first time delivering it, but I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
We never say stuff like that. We just say, yes, I'm an amazing genius.
Yes.
How is that encouraging to the people around us?
100%. And I think, it's something that I've been the beneficiary of working in the sustainability space is I've had incredible mentors like John Elkington who have kind of taken me under their wing and not expected brilliance. I've in much of the time that I was working at Volan's and in that space, I was entirely there to be a fly on the wall. I was just absorbing, and I was on this exponential learning curve. And I think that is what has placed me where I am now. But we need to create those opportunities for more curious young people who have the appetite, because exactly as you said, if you hand them the microphone and expect them to be brilliant and articulate and eloquent from point blank, it is going to do nothing but reinforce negative self-beliefs that they have.
This is, I think, the most important thing as well, is that determining who you listen to. Whose criticism are you listening to?
Yes.
So I love Brené Brown, right? Obviously, legendary TED speaker, people, millions and millions and millions of views on her talks. Last year, towards the end of the year, she released a Netflix special, which is amazing, by the way.
Yeah.
And it hit me over the head. It was like a wake up call. It was so good. And in it, she talks about this quote. It's this idea of when you're fighting for something, when you're putting yourself out there, when you're making yourself vulnerable, you're like a gladiator in the arena. Right? You're there's blood on your face, you're cut, dirt, you're tired, you're sweating. And then people just throwing stuff and yelling insults at you from the stands. It's pretty meaningless, right? If you spend all your time listening to those people, what are you doing? You should only listen to the people who are in the arena with you, who are struggling and fighting, the same thing that you are fighting, or at least are putting themselves out there. I think this is so important. It's so easy to be an armchair critic.
Yes.
It's so easy to throw shade online, and fine, but are you putting yourself out there? Are you making yourself vulnerable? If you've got dirt under your fingernails and like blood on your face and you're sweating,
you have street cred.
I'm going to listen. I'm going to be a bit more open to listening to you, right?
I was recently listening to a podcast with Boy and Slat, the fellow who designed this technology to try and clean up ocean plastic. And he was very candid about how difficult the first few years have been and the number of failures they've had to overcome, and that only now have they developed a technology that is actually working in a super exciting way. And he talked about dealing with those trolls and how easy, when you face any problem, it is to say, it's too hard, what you're doing is a mistake, you're just putting a Band-Aid over the problem, all of these things. And yet you have zero legs to stand on if you, exactly as you said, are being the armchair expert and you're not actually getting your hands dirty. Yeah.
We can all actually be really important and effective by being good allies. Particularly online, but also offline. Like, you don't have to be the one developing the technology or speaking out in front of a crowd. You can be the one making sure that person knows that they're loved, that their work is appreciated. You can be the one who is kind of addressing the trolls so the person doesn't have to do all the work. The one bringing the conversation back to the actual subject rather than letting it get derailed by online trolls.
Speaking of critics, how have you dealt with critics in your own life, other than those that exist within your own mind?
Just so you know, the critics in my own mind, I call them gremlins.
Gremlins.
Yeah, there's a grandfather gremlin, like the original gremlin, and he is the good enough gremlin. He's the one that says I'm not good enough, and then all his babies, all his little spawn gremlin, are like, you're not blank enough. Like, you're not smart enough, you're not thin enough, you're not rich enough, you're not whatever enough. So that's my internal gremlins.
I think this is super interesting in the context of some of the work that my mum has been doing, funnily enough. So she works in the realm of psychotherapy, and her kind of sweet spot is unpacking the shadow and looking at the shadow self and core destructive beliefs. And we were unpacking my own core destructive beliefs in this 4-hour marathon session. And she picked up on a really interesting trend in other change makers, quote unquote, activists she's worked with, which is that our most consistent core destructive belief is I am not enough. I am not powerful enough. I am not doing enough. I am not good enough. And I think that is because so much of our sense of self and value and how we show up is defined by achieving these often impossible kind of problems. Yep. And we project so much responsibility onto ourselves, carry the weight of the world. Yep. How have you managed some of your gremlins? And do you think there is something beneficial that they bring into the color of your life?
I don't love my gremlins, but I accept them as being there. The most important thing I've been able to do is name them and identify them and know when they're speaking and know when I'm speaking. For so long, their voice was indistinguishable from my own voice. Because you do have voices in your head that say, hang on a second, is this right? Like good voices that are there to help you like judge risk and understand the world around you and say, is this really what you want to do? Or, but they sound very similar to your gremlins, and you have to do some work to distinguish those voices. That was like the first and most massive piece, because I think then when you can separate out, you can choose how to respond.
Yeah.
Right? It no longer just becomes something that overwhelms you. You're like, oh, okay.
That you're controlled by.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, okay, gremlin speaking. Am I going to listen? Today I'm going to listen.
Yeah.
Tomorrow I'm not going to listen. Yes. Am I going to let it upset me? Am I not? The other thing was speaking about them. Mm-hmm. Massive. Gremlins are powerful because they're secret.
Yes.
Yeah. And because they derive their power from making you feel alone.
Yeah, exactly.
When you realize that everyone feels that way, they have much less power over you. And then the third thing for me was I got angry. I looked around and I saw very mediocre people claiming they were experts in the work I did. And there I am fretting over whether I can even say I do this work and whether I have a legitimacy to even be in this space. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm not an expert. Sure, because I don't even know what that means. But I'm definitely better than these dudes. And if they can be here, I can be here. The more you succeed in life, the more you change the things you're doing, your gremlins are going to evolve with you. You don't outgrow them. They grow with you. So maybe, like the things that they were saying that you couldn't do when you started your career and you're now able to do, it's not like they go away. They just grow. And now they tell you that the more adventurous things you want to do, you can't do.
I found whenever I've encountered like external critics in my own life, if anything, that has fueled me more because I reconciled some of those internal gremlins. And it's almost like putting the finger into the system.
If you want me to do something, the best thing to do is tell me I shouldn't do it.
I love this. I relate to it on such
a deep
level.
I think it's amazing that you had that conversation with your mum and you identified that change makers have these core destructive beliefs around not being good enough. I think I would add to that as I said, the good enough takes different forms, and I can imagine that there's this core belief. I think when you add change makers who are women, who are people of color or whatever it might be, there's like added layer of not being good enough that comes from society because you're a change maker because you want to change maybe some of the injustices that you've experienced in the world, and the world is telling you you're not good enough to do that. That's part of the injustice, right? So it's there's a lot tied up in that. And there's a lot that you have to overcome there.
One of the kind of core destructive beliefs that I've encountered in the classroom time and time again is being too small to make a difference, and the system is too broken, the problems are too overwhelming. What would your response be to some of the young people who are kind of beholden to that dystopian view of the future and their own smallness in the face of it? And how have you kind of navigated that, and what do you do when it feels like it's too much?
You have to find what you're good at and do that and make the change there. Because if everyone does that, that's what works. I was really involved in Iranian politics and human rights campaigning. I was really involved in working on refugee and migrant rights. When I was younger, I was really involved in like global warming and animal rights and stuff. And I always gave up because I couldn't see a solution, right? I couldn't see it working because, there are all these hidden global power structures you're fighting against. You don't even know they're there and you're fighting against them. And that can feel really overwhelming. And when I was in human rights, I thought, this is how I'm going to make a difference, right? This is the thing I'm going to do. What I'm doing now is my best way to contribute, to empower and enable other people to be able to speak with their own voice to make a difference. My friend works for the UN in their Human Rights Council, and she works in some pretty difficult situations. Her name's Paula. She's wonderful. I said, Paula, I'm losing my faith in all this. How do you do it? And she said, every single one of us is a drop. All the efforts we make are a drop. We have no idea which drop is going to be the one that like overflows, that changes the tide. And the people you hear about in the world are the drop that did that. So the Nelson Mandelas in the world are the drop. But he would not have been that drop if all the ones had not come before. So you just keep going and like dripping into this bucket of change, knowing that eventually it fills up, and not knowing who it's going to be the one that like makes it overflow. And I don't know why, but that has sustained me for a very long time.
Paula is so wise.
Paula is so wise. I'm going to send this to Paula and tell her how amazing
Paula.
she is. Paula is just, everyone should listen to Paula. Everyone should have a Paula in their life, basically.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's another thing I'd love to talk about is like tribe and community. But what you touched on is also having that kind of container. And it's what, we try to instill in the young people we work with is, if you try to spread yourself thin across all of the things, all of the causes, you're just going to burn out, you're going to feel overwhelmed, and you're going to reinforce your own feeling of kind of like tokenism in the face of these challenges. And it's a story and a myth that is perpetuated by the sustainability industry every time you're told to turn off the lights when you leave a room or change your light bulbs, or in the social justice space that signing a petition is enough, right? And so that whole mode is kind of broken. when we find focus and when we go really deep with something and use, as you said, what you're naturally good at and gifted at and passionate about as a kind of conduit for that, you create the container to be able to download and get deep into the problem without becoming entirely disenfranchised.
Yeah. But you have to be careful with one thing with doing that. We can become so passionate and focused on the thing we're working on at the exclusion of others. So what it needs is for you to say, I am working on, working with young people on climate change. And this person is working on carbon drawdown. And this person is working on human rights. And that person is working on, economic justice. And every single one of us is as important as the other. And every single one of us has to succeed. And so in my movement, I'm going to make room for that because I want them to make room in their movement for me.
Yes.
Right. So I remember working with this incredible woman, Juno Mack. She's a sex worker. She works on sex worker rights. And she just said, if you care about human rights, if you care about economic justice, if you care about sustainability, if you care about, the rights of women, if you care about LGBT rights, if you care about all of these different things, welcome us into your movements because we are part of that conversation too. So it's this idea of like being a connected container, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
But what I've seen in the past that really is, I think, not been constructive is where people get really focused at the exclusion of everything else.
Absolutely. And I think I was on the phone to my friend Chad Frischman the other day, who's the chief researcher at Project Drawdown. And we were talking about silos and bubbles because Drawdown was such a breakthrough in thinking for me because suddenly climate change as this kind of like alienating, overwhelming challenge was suddenly made super available and accessible by the diversity of the problems, but also the solutions, and saying no matter whether you want to look at food waste management or education for girls or women's reproductive rights, every piece of that is an essential part of that program. And one of the ways that Project Drawdown's often misappropriated is that, there are 100 of the top solutions and people go, okay, well, we just need to do the top 10 because they're the most important. And what Chad's always re-emphasizing is like, no. It's entirely across the board. Like everyone needs to be activating across each of these areas. And we were talking about silos and bubbles. And he was saying, instead of being in these bubbles, we almost need to be in this like bubble bath,
I love it, Chad. I love the bubble bath.
I mean, you would love Chad. You guys would get along really, really well. But that's it. It's like we need to it kind of all weave together and like be part of this matrix and invite one another into our movements. And it's stunning how often I hear that story perpetuating that, but climate change is the most important thing. And it's like climate change is a symptom. And one of the solutions is making a more effective kind of society. It's reinstating our humanism. It's reinstating our humanity. Right? And so you can't, like, that's the very reason why we're in this problem in the first place is that mechanistic thinking.
You told a great story to me the other day because I was telling you about how with OpenX and young people, one of my real desires is to make sure that we can bring more people of color, urban young people of color into the conversation around climate change because I think their voices are not heard and also they don't see themselves as part of this. And you were saying how you've seen this in the classroom and how actually the way to get people who have almost other priorities is to see this as part of it. It's not just that climate change is part of everything they care about, is that everything they care about is also part of like they will reach their aims through these as well, right?
Exactly. And it's shifting to how we're creating an invitation to people that is about well-being because, it's super easy to remain in your kind of like tier of privilege, right? And think about, okay, but, how am I shopping at Whole Foods and, how am I doing these things, whatnot? The reality for the vast majority of people is, they're thinking about how to make it through to the end of the week, right? How to get food on the table, how to keep the lights on, how to look after their children. How are you crafting an inclusive narrative for those people? How are you improving their lives rather than asking them to care about something that is entirely existential and at this point in time is not already on our doorstep?
For TEDxLondon Women, we worked with this incredible economist and environmentalist, Angela Francis at the WWF, and she talked about this idea of what the Gilets jaunes protesters in France were talking about, which was saying, you want us to care about the end of the world, we're worried about the end of the week. And her point is it's not about edging climate to the top of people's agenda. It's about showing them how the solutions to climate also provide the solutions to the things already on their agenda. And I thought that is really different.
Yes, exactly. And they don't have to be separate. That's the magical thing.
No. You asked about criticism. I mean, I'll tell you one thing about criticism is I look for some of it now. I seek it out. Sometimes for TEDx, we get criticism like from people who've either attended or just are online saying, too diverse.
Too diverse.
Felt like a diversity and inclusion training. And I was like, first of all, you should be so lucky that your diversity and inclusion trainings are this amazing. And second of all, cool.
Yeah.
Like, awesome. Like if if someone once said, I didn't learn anything new here, I was like, okay, well, that's really good because you live in like a progressive, amazing bubble. And I want to live in that world with you because I learned new things here. So I think sometimes you can get so wrapped up with those kinds of criticisms, those kinds of things that when actually you have to decide like, okay, so you're not going to please everyone when you're putting stuff out into the world. What kind of feedback do you want? If I'm pissing off the right people, then I'm doing a good job.
How do you toe that line? Like how much energy do you exert trying to change mindsets and persuade people? And to what degree do you just say, actually, no, this is my emphasis. Like that's my audience.
Do I preach to the choir is basically it, right? Am I happy preaching to the choir? I think there's two things. One is sometimes the choir just needs a bit of motivation. And if we can be that, I'm okay. Because you know what? I get tired sometimes. With the deluge of like negativity out there, sometimes you need to sit in a room with people who see the world the way you see the world and tell you about how we can solve the big problems.
Yes.
About how they have made positive change. All of our speakers have to do one of three things, if not more. Impact people's knowledge, their attitudes, or their practice. Not everyone will do all. Like very few people will, so actually then you're not just preaching to the choir because the way you influence people is so different. Each person brings so much difference. Basically, I think you can divide the public into four basic categories: left, right, leaning to the left, leaning to the right. All pollsters will tell you that almost every single issue out there, that's the four categories that people fall into. And you cannot message the same way to any of the groups. The messaging that works for the people who are already on the left turns off the people leaning to the left. But the messaging for the people leaning to the left turns off the people in the left. Right? So we used to do this on immigration. Messaging around migrants being grateful and being here to, contribute to society and work hard and loving being in the UK really worked to people leaning to the left and really pissed the rest of us on the left off. Right? Because you're like, why do they have to be grateful? Like, what, for the racism? Right? So I realized that actually it's okay to have different audiences and different messages will work. It's the both and. The only way it works is if you really want people to be coming over to your way of seeing the world, you have to accept the fact that different groups, different organizations are going to have to communicate in different ways to different audiences. And if we see each other all as like, instead of seeing each other as competing, if we see each other as just having different targets and all pushing in a different way, it's much more effective.
Yes, because we have the tendency to say, well, that messaging doesn't work and Greta's too angry. And it's like, actually, no, like we need everyone action stations.
Everyone. The difference being a campaigner and being an activist. An activist holds for me, an activist holds the line. An activist is at the far side of the Overton window or whatever you want to use, holding the end. They are the like they are the goal, right? They're uncompromising and they're angry and they're loud and they get your attention, and that's exactly what they should do. Campaigners work with people along the spectrum, pushing them a little bit further towards that person.
Interesting.
You need both.
Yeah.
You can't have one. If you only have campaigners, there's no way to go. And if you only have activists, the people are still just stuck where they are. So we need to see ourselves more as an ecosystem working together rather than people competing.
What do you think some of the most essential ingredients are then for persuasion and influence?
Taking time to understand why you're speaking and why someone might be listening and what they care about in the world. What is your core message? Like, what is the one thing you want to get across? Who is your audience? How do they think about the world? Who are they? Why they're listening? What motivates them? How can you get them to care? Which is bringing those two things together. How do you bring what you're saying alive with stories? And why do you care about this? And why are you excited about it? It's bringing all of that stuff together is how you influence and persuade people.
It's too lazy to say, well, it's important.
It's important to you.
Yeah.
But even that's too lazy. Even just saying it's important to me. Why?
Yeah.
Why is it? Tell me about yourself. We connect because of stories, right? For example, I don't think it's my job to convince people that as a woman, I have a right not to be sexually assaulted. Right? But there are people who believe that. So what do? That's where I think allies come in. It's the job of my male allies to do that convincing.
Yeah.
Right? Just like I don't think trans people need to defend their right to exist. But you know what? As an ally to trans people, I can do the work of having conversations with people who have problematic points of view and getting them to understand why that maybe isn't the right way to think.
Yeah.
In some issues, you can be an activist. In some issues, you can be a campaigner.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a super important distinction that you make because it creates fluidity, which is super, super important. On the topic of tribe and community, because I know that this is a theme that you speak to a lot, I would love to learn a little more about the tribe that you've built around yourself and the role of having a tribe to create the foundations upon which you can go out in the world and test your ideas and open yourself up to critics. Because I think this can feel like such a lonely task if you're not surrounded by people who can kind of validate your assumptions, but also, you know, share the same values. And yet it's only with that kind of foundation that you can then go out and be provocative and open yourself up to questions and, you know, challenging your mindset.
I think it's important to have a champion. I don't mean a cheerleader. I don't mean an advocate. You know, I don't mean a coach. I mean a champion. Someone who believes in you, but is also willing to do the work to help you get there and who is there with you. And it's not your mum. Like my mum is a big champion of mine, but she's not my champion because she's my mum. She does other things that make her my champion. A lot of young women I work with will ask me what my biggest piece of advice is. And I'm like, if you are straight or bi, be very careful who you date in your life if you want to be successful and make change. Because they will derail you so quickly.
In what ways? Undermining
you. Why are you so focused on your work? Why is your work more important than me? Why, you know, this idea, this assumption, this thing that I think a lot of straight women face, women who date men, a lot of things that we face is this idea, especially for those of us who are active and outspoken and dynamic. And there's this assumption that like, you were like that before you met me, but now you've met me, you're going to calm down, right? What do you mean you're still going to be out there, you know, working nights and doing this and focusing on that? It is so easy to get derailed by it. I see it all the time.
It's so funny that you're saying this because I had this experience last year.
I mean, I see it all the time.
Yeah, and it's like, it was so nuanced at first. It was just like, it was subtleties in like how I was dressing and how I was acting around that person. And then like suddenly it starts like snowballing and you're like, suddenly I'm compromising on the very things that make me really happy and that defined me pre-relationship.
Yeah. All relationships are compromise, right? But what are you compromising? If the very thing that attracted the person to you is your voice, and then they expect you to shut that down when you're with them, then they weren't really attracted to that, right? They were attracted to some kind of veneer. This is all of the things around the changing gender roles, around the expectations we have, around the fluidity of gender and sexuality. These things make it very, very hard. But we still live in a patriarchy, so we can still all fall victim to it.
It speaks to a much wider kind of narrative around compromise and sacrifice and regret, you know, and I think that can be super powerful. It's like projecting into the future and looking back at your life in the present moment and thinking, would I have regretted the decision that I'm about to make?
And let's not forget that some of the most misogynistic and abusive men I have ever come across in my life work for social change. They are human rights lawyers. They are activists. They are people who are praised and lauded on the outside for the amazing work they do, and the way they treat women in their private life is so despicable. It was the biggest lesson I learned when I was 18. It was like, it opened my eyes in a way that I just will never be closed again.
There is greater license given to them, if anything.
Yes, because they're working for their cause. The cause. Yeah, look at Oxfam. Look at Save the Children. Look at all these scandals that came through. You know, this was exactly the way those men were behaving, and they were given that license because what they were doing was seen as so important. Those men did not become that way all of a sudden. They were slowly allowed to be that way over time.
And as you said, just as it is the responsibility of men to stand for equality for women and to call out bad behavior, so too is it my responsibility as a cis white woman to stand up for people in the LGBTQ plus community and, you know, take on that responsibility as my own. And I think none of us can sit idly by and watch the world go by and say, well, it's not my position, it's not my role, it's not my story.
No,
it's part of the fabric of the society that we want to create.
We're all struggling together. And sometimes we have to stand up for our trans sisters. Sometimes we have to stand up for our Black sisters. Sometimes we have to stand up for the men in our lives. But we all have to do it together. Who you choose to surround yourself with is going to be so important in what you're able to do, because relationships drain you or they sustain you. And it is hard when you're young. You know, when you decide to cut people out of your life, people react really badly. But you know what? It's so important to be careful. I really like Star Trek. And I always used to think about it as, who is my bridge crew? Right? If I'm the captain, who's my bridge crew? Who's my number one? Who's my counselor? Who's my doctor? Who's my engineer? Who's my, you know, language? Like all, but also like, well, who are the people I need in my bridge crew to be able to complete this mission? And those should be the closest people to me. And I don't mean professionally, I mean personally.
Well, what do you want your legacy to be, Maryam?
I created space for people to learn how to speak to bring about change. That's what I want my legacy to be.